The storm had no mercy for the mountains of the north. It arrived the way all terrible things arrived, without warning, without apology, sweeping down from the peaks in curtains of white that swallowed the tree line whole and turned the narrow pass into something that no longer resembled a road. The wind moved like a living thing, pressing against every surface it could find, and the cold it carried was the kind that reached inside a person and found the soft, vital center of them and simply began to squeeze. Ice crusted the stone walls of the outer settlement. Trees groaned under the weight of it, and somewhere in the middle of all that beautiful, indifferent violence, a woman was walking. Maren had been walking for 3 days. She did not know precisely how many miles she had covered. She had stopped counting somewhere around the second morning when the blisters on her heels had cracked open, and the counting had stopped feeling useful. What she knew was the weight of the pack on her back, the herbs wrapped in oilskin, the remedies stoppered in small dark bottles, the mortar and pestle wrapped in wool so the glass wouldn't shatter. And she knew the smell of the storm as it pressed down on her, and she knew the way her lungs ached with every breath of air that was too cold to be kind. She was a healer from the valley settlements. She had no business being on the road to Vorkath. No one had business on the road to Vorkath. That was the point. The fortress sat at the crown of the northern range like a scar, gray stone against gray sky, visible in clear weather from 3 settlements below, as a reminder that certain things in this world were not approachable. Certain powers did not invite inspection. The Alpha who ruled from Vorkath had not descended to the valley settlements in 11 years. He sent his emissaries. He sent his taxes. He sent, occasionally, his soldiers when the border disputes flared. Great silent men with the mark of the Vorkath pack burned into the skin below their left ears, who came and went without looking anyone in the eye. The Alpha himself stayed behind his walls, and the stories that circulated about him in the lower territories were so layered with time and embellishment that no one could have separated truth from fear any more if they had tried. Maren had tried. She had spent the 2 days before she left cataloging what she actually knew versus what she had been told. What she actually knew. The Alpha's name was Calder. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily large, even by werewolf standards. He had ruled the north for 13 years, beginning at an age younger than most pack leaders. He had not taken a mate. He had never lost a border war. His second in command was a woman named Priya, who communicated on his behalf, and whom most people in the valley found less frightening than the Alpha only because she smiled, while she told them things they didn't want to hear. These were facts. They could be verified. What she had been told. Calder of Vorkath had killed 3 Alphas with his bare hands. He had eyes like winter ice, and he used them the way other men used weapons. He had refused the mate bond once. Refused it deliberately, consciously, which was either impossible or the most frightening thing a werewolf had ever done, depending on who you asked. He did not permit weakness in his territory. He did not permit exceptions to his rules. He had sent a delegation back from the eastern packs with a single message delivered by Priya in her quiet, even voice. Approach Vorkath uninvited, and whatever happens to you is your own concern. Maren pressed her face against the wind and kept walking. She had not come because she wanted to. She had come because she was the only person left who could. The illness had started in the northern settlements 6 weeks ago. Small things first. Fatigue, a cough that didn't resolve, fever that climbed and climbed, and then in some cases didn't stop climbing. The pack healers in the outer territories had tried everything they knew, and when they ran out of what they knew, they had sent for Maren. Because Maren had trained under the oldest healer in the valley who had trained under the oldest healer before her. And because Maren had a particular gift, her mother had called it attunement, her teachers had called it diagnostic instinct. The pack wolves who came to her called it something they couldn't name but recognized immediately, a quality of presence and attention that made a person feel that their body's secrets were safe with her. She had come to the northern settlements, and she had identified what they were dealing with inside of 2 days. Bone fever, ancient, rare, and genuinely terrible. It moved through pack bonds like a current through water, person to person along the invisible lines that connected wolves to their mates and their pack, which was why the outer settlements were losing people faster than they could tend to them. And if it was moving through pack bonds, that meant it was moving upward. That meant it would reach the apex of every pack bond chain it ran along, and the apex of the northern pack's chain was Vorkath, was Calder. She had sent a message with a rider 3 weeks ago, no response. She had sent another 2 weeks ago, more urgent, no response. She had sent a third, last week, from the outer settlements where she was watching people die. And the rider had come back with nothing. Just reported that the gates of Vorkath had not opened, that no one had appeared, that he had left the message with a soldier at the outer wall and turned back. Maren was not the kind of person who waited when waiting meant people died. She was also not, if she was being honest, the kind of person who walked into the mountain fortress of the most feared Alpha in the north without so much as an escort. She was not brave in the way that stories described bravery. She was not tall or impressive or terrifying. She was of medium height, with the kind of plain, tired face that people looked at and immediately felt comfortable, which was useful in her work and less useful in confrontations. She had brown eyes and dark hair that was currently frozen at the tips from the storm, and she was wearing 4 layers of clothing that still weren't quite enough, and her feet hurt, and she was afraid. She was afraid, and she was going anyway because the alternative was unacceptable. The outer walls of Vorkath appeared through the storm like something that had always been there, inevitable. She heard the gate soldiers before she saw them. The shift of weight, the sound of a voice, low and warning, and then a torch materialized in the white blur of the storm, and there were 2 men looking down at her from the wall. And she stopped, and she tilted her head back, and she said, loudly enough to be heard over the wind, "My name is Maren of the Valley Settlements. I'm a healer. I need to speak with whoever is in charge." There was a long pause. Then one of the soldiers called down, "The Alpha does not receive uninvited guests." The Alpha, Maren said, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, is going to be very unwell very soon if he hasn't received his treatment. And I am the only person in 4 territories who can provide it. So whoever you need to ask for permission, I would ask them quickly. I've been walking for 3 days and I'm out of patience. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the gates opened. The interior of Vorkath was nothing like what the stories had suggested. She had expected something bleak and martial, all stone and severity. What she found was a fortress that was simply old. Old in the way that mountains were old, shaped not by decoration but by time and use. The stone worn smooth in the most traveled places. The walls hung with the banners of packs, long since absorbed into the northern territory. Torches burned at intervals that were warm rather than dramatic. The courtyard was clean. The wolves who moved through it were purposeful and quiet, and several of them glanced at her with the alert, measuring attention of pack members assessing an unknown presence in their space. But no one stopped her. A soldier escorted her inside without speaking, and she followed him through corridors that were wide and cold and smelled of stone dust and old wood fires. And then, through a set of doors that were tall enough to suggest they had been built for someone large. And then into a room that it was clearly a working study rather than a throne room, with maps on the walls and an unlit fireplace, and a table covered in papers, and a man standing with his back to her, looking out a window that faced the storm. She almost said something. Then she didn't, because something stopped her. Not caution exactly, but a kind of suddenly sharpened attention. The same instinct that made her pause before approaching a patient whose distress was more than physical. He hadn't moved. She hadn't announced herself. But something in the room had shifted the moment she stepped through the door. The soldier cleared her throat. "My lord," the healer from the valley. Calder of Vorkath turned around. The stories had told her he was large, and she had accounted for that. They had told her he was cold, and she had accounted for that too. What the stories had not told her, what no amount of catalog or preparation could have told her, was the way the room changed when he was facing her. It wasn't dramatic in the way she would have expected. No sense of threat or dominance pressed against her like a hand at her throat. It was quieter than that, and somehow more affecting, the way his attention settled on her with a weight and precision that made her aware of every square inch of her own body. His eyes were gray, not the pale theatrical gray of the stories, but a deep, dense gray like the underside of storm clouds, the kind that carried weather. He was looking at her the way she looked at patients. She wasn't sure she could save. "You sent 3 messages," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had learned long ago that the room would quiet itself. "And you sent no response?" Marin said. She didn't mean for it to come out so flat. It came out flat anyway. Something very small moved across his face. Not offense. Something more difficult to name. "My second handled correspondence for the last month. I wasn't informed of the content." Marin processed this. "You've been ill." It wasn't a question. She could see it now. The slight tightness around his eyes. The quality of his stillness that was conservation rather than composure. She had spent enough years reading bodies to recognize when stillness was a choice made from necessity. He was managing something. Had been managing it, probably, for weeks. "That's a matter for discussion," he said, which was the most elaborate way she had ever heard a person say yes. "It's bone fever," she said. "It's moving through the pack bonds from the outer settlements inward. You've been the apex of the chain long enough that it's been building in you for at least 3 weeks, possibly 4. The symptoms in the outer settlements were fatigue and fever before the acute phase. I'd estimate you've been in the acute phase for a week, maybe less, managing it on your own because you didn't want your pack to know." The stillness in the room became a different kind of stillness. "How?" he said slowly. "Do you know that?" "Because you're standing," she said. "Because you turned to look at me, rather than asking who was there. Because the fire isn't lit, and it's very cold, and you haven't asked anyone to light it, which means you've been running a high enough fever that the cold feels good. And because you're the most feared alpha in the north, and I'm a stranger who walked 3 days through a mountain storm to get to you, and the only thing you've said to me so far is that you didn't know about my messages, which means you're using every available resource to appear unbothered rather than to actually address what's happening to you." The silence stretched. Then, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man unlearning something, "What do you need?" She had expected resistance. She had prepared for it, had rehearsed variations of the argument she would need to make, had anticipated the refusal and the dismissal, and perhaps the being sent back into the storm. She had not prepared for immediate, direct acquiescence, and for a moment it undid her more completely than the fear had. "A room," she said, "a fire, clean water, and somewhere to work. And your honest account of every symptom you've had, starting from the beginning, without editing it to sound less severe." He looked at her for another moment. "Priya!" he said without raising his voice. And the door opened, and the woman who had to be Priya appeared with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been within range the entire time, dark-eyed and watchful, taking in Marin with a single comprehensive glance before settling her attention on Calder. The healer needs a room and workspace. See to it. He paused. And have someone light the fire in here. Priya's expression did not change, but her eyes, when they moved to Marin again, held something that might have been relief. The room they gave her was adjacent to the Alpha's private corridor, which she understood was both practical. She would need to check on him through the night, and a statement of something she didn't examine too closely yet. She unpacked her herbs on the table they brought and lined up her bottles in the order she would need them, and began the quiet, focused process of compounding what she knew he needed. Her hands finding the familiar rhythms while her mind stayed busy with everything she'd observed in those first few minutes. He was sicker than he was letting on. She had seen the slight pallor beneath the weathered tone of his skin. The way he'd shifted his weight once, briefly, before correcting it. The fever had been building for long enough that his body was spending resources just to maintain the appearance of stability. Bone fever in a werewolf of his strength and age was not automatically fatal. The body's enhanced regenerative capacity was the one mercy the illness allowed, but it could become fatal if untreated. And more immediately dangerous, it compromised the pack bond itself, which meant that if the apex bond weakened or broke, every wolf connected to it would feel it like a physical blow, and the illness moving through those bonds could accelerate catastrophically. She needed him to be honest with her. She was not sure, yet, whether he knew how to be. She brought the first treatment to him just past midnight, when the fortress had settled into the particular quiet of a place where everyone was asleep except the sentries and the worried. He was still at the table with the maps which told her everything, and she set the cup down within his reach without comment, and stood on the other side of the table and said, "Start from the beginning." "I don't document illness," he said. "I'm not asking you to document it. I'm asking you to tell me." He looked at the cup. He looked at her. Something in his expression moved, very carefully, like something testing weight on uncertain ice. 6 weeks ago, he said. Fatigue. I thought it was campaign season carrying over. A pause. 4 weeks ago, fever. Manageable. I've had worse. And when did the pain start? She asked. His eyes came up sharply. Bone fever, she said. It's in the name. I need to know when. Another pause, this one longer. 3 weeks ago, he said. At night, initially. It didn't affect function. Does it still not affect function? The quality of his silence was her answer. All right, she said. She pushed the cup slightly closer. Drink that. All of it. Even though it tastes like the inside of a pine tree. I'll be back in 2 hours with the next dose. Between now and then, I'd like you to eat something, even if you're not hungry. Lie down if you're willing, and tell me, when I come back, whether the pain is in the long bones or the joints, because that affects what I add to the morning treatment. He picked up the cup. He looked at it. He said, without quite looking at her, "Why did you come yourself?" She had been moving toward the door. She stopped. "I sent riders and they didn't reach you. The situation in the outer settlements is acute. There wasn't another option." There was, he said. You could have decided it wasn't your problem. It is my problem, she said. People are dying. People die all the time, he said. Not cruelly. She heard the test in it, the measuring, the same instinct she had felt when he'd looked at her in that first moment. He was not being callous. He was asking her something. Yes, she said, and some of them don't have to. She opened the door. Drink the tea, Calder. She used his name without thinking. In the doorway, walking away, she heard the silence that followed it and felt it settle on her skin like a change in temperature. She checked on him twice through the night, once to find him at the table still, the cup empty, the maps shoved aside in favor of what appeared to be a report he had written and then set face down. And once, at the 4th hour before dawn, to find him asleep in the chair near the window with his head tipped back and the firelight on his face. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, and watched. The way sleep had softened something in the particular architecture of his expression, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not prepared to examine. She checked his temperature with the back of her hand at his forehead, as carefully as if he were made of something breakable. And he didn't wake. And she stood there a moment more. And then she went back to her room and sat at the table for a long time before she started on the morning treatment. The days took on a structure quickly, the way days did when there was serious work to do. She tended to the treatment schedule with the same precision she brought to all her work. The morning compound, the midday assessment, the evening treatment, the night check. She sent letters to the outer settlements with adjusted instructions for the healers there, explaining what the disease progression looked like and what the current compound should address in each phase. She slept when she slept, in unpredictable fragments, waking to check notes or rethink a compound, or lie in the dark of the strange room and listen to the wind off the mountains. And she spent hours with Calder. This was not, initially, what she had planned. She had planned a clinical relationship, thorough and warm, in the way she was warm with all her patients, present, attentive, genuinely invested in their recovery, but boundaried by the professional understanding that her care was her skill, and her skill was not personal. She had planned to come in, assess, treat, document, leave. She had not planned for him to ask her, on the second morning, what she actually understood about bone fever's mechanism. With the specific focused interest of a person who genuinely wanted to know the answer. She had not planned to find herself explaining viral propagation through pack bonds for 40 minutes, while he asked increasingly precise questions. And she answered them, and they both forgot, intermittently, that she was the healer and he was the patient. He was one of the most intelligent people she had encountered. This surprised her in a way she was not proud of. She had expected the stories, had expected the cold and the distance and the dominance, and those things were present. But they were a surface laid over something else, something that she found herself mapping with the same careful attentiveness she brought to an unfamiliar illness. He was curious. He was controlled in a way that had clearly been learned rather than innate, with moments where something more unguarded moved through the control, like weather through glass. He was alone in a way that was so practiced and complete that she suspected he had forgotten to notice it. On the 4th day, she came in for the midday assessment to find him standing at the window again. And this time the pallor was lessening, and his stillness had more ease in it. And she felt the particular relief she always felt when a treatment was working, warm and solidly satisfying. She checked his temperature, noting clinically the warmth of his skin under her fingers, and ignoring what that warmth did to her own pulse. "Better," she said. "I told you it wasn't bad." "You told me it didn't affect function," she corrected, which was not the same thing, and we both knew it. She made a note. The pack bonds should be carrying cleaner signal in another 2 days. I'll need to hear from the outer settlements to confirm the cascade is reversing. But the pattern is consistent with resolution. "And then you'll leave," he said. She looked up. He was looking out the window, not at her, and his voice had the same even, controlled quality it always had. But something underneath it was different, and she made herself note the difference and not leap at what it might mean. "When my patients are stable," she said, That's always been the condition. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, still looking out the window, you said the illness moved through pack bonds. Yes, the fated mate bond is the strongest pack bond there is. The room was very quiet. The fire was burning well now. She had started insisting on it, and he had stopped arguing, and it cast warm, uneven light on the maps and the papers and the side of his face. Yes, she said again. Her voice was very careful. My wolf has been restless since the night you arrived, he said. I assumed it was the fever. It's not the fever. Marin set her notes down on the table. She looked at her own hands for a moment, at the ink stains on the side of her right hand and the callus on her index finger, from the small knife she used for cutting herbs. She was a valley healer in a borrowed room in the fortress of the most feared Alpha in the north. And she had been careful. She had been so careful not to let herself acknowledge the thing that had been true since the moment she'd walked through his door, and the room had changed. I know, she said. He turned from the window then. She had seen his face in many states over the past 4 days. Controlled, assessing, occasionally in the unguarded relief of sleep. But she had not seen this particular arrangement before. And it took her a moment to recognize it, because it wasn't an expression she had associated with him. It was something uncertain, something almost young. You're afraid of what it means, she said, not an accusation. The same tone she used with patients whose honesty mattered more than their comfort. I've refused the bond before, he said. She had heard this. She had catalogued it, had labeled it impossible or terrifying, depending on the framework. Looking at him now, she understood it differently. How long ago? 9 years. Why? The silence was different this time, heavier, because the woman the bond offered was 19 years old, and I was 28, and I had just begun a war on 3 fronts. And I could not keep her safe. I could not keep anyone safe. I released the bond before she ever knew it had formed. He said it the way people said things they had said to themselves, alone many times, with the precision of something rehearsed not for an audience, but for endurance. And your wolf never forgave you, Marin said. My wolf, he said, has been punishing me for 9 years. She understood then several things simultaneously. The coldness that the stories told, the distance, the walls, high enough to be visible from 3 settlements below. She understood it the way she understood illness, as a body's response to a wound, logical and overreaching at once. I'm not 19, she said. No, and this is not 9 years ago. No, he said. And then, after a pause that had a whole weather system inside it, I don't know how to do this. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. Marin picked up her notes. She looked at them without reading them. She set them back down. I've been walking into situations I don't know how to handle since I was 17, she said. I find that the best method is to start with what you do know and work outward from there. What do I know? He asked. That the bond is real, she said. That you've spent 9 years trying to live without it. That your wolf chose me for a reason. And that I walked 3 days through a mountain storm to get here, which tells you something about what I'm capable of when I decide something matters. Something broke open, very slowly, in his expression. It wasn't dramatic. It was the way ice melted, not in a moment of heat, but in the slow, incremental surrender to it, the thing that had been held so long and so firmly finally beginning to give way. Stay, he said. Just that, one word, without the armor he wore around everything else. Through the resolution. Don't give me a timeline. Just stay. She looked at him for a long time, at the storm cloud gray of his eyes and the exhaustion he carried like a second spine, at the man inside the stories who had turned out to be so much more difficult and so much more comprehensible than any of the stories had managed. She thought about her room in the valley and her work and the outer settlements and the people she had left, who would need her when the illness resolved. She thought about all of it, and she thought about the way the room had changed when she'd walked through his door, and the way her chest had moved when she'd watched him sleep. Through the resolution, she said, "We'll talk about what comes after." The fortnight that followed was not simple. She had not expected simple. Simple was not, she had long since concluded, a thing that happened to her, and she suspected it was not a thing that happened to Calder of Vorkath either. The kind of people who became who they were through the particular combination of gifts and wounds and choices that had made, each of them did not generally find themselves in simple situations. The illness in the outer settlements was stubborn. There were 3 deaths in the most severely affected settlement before her adjusted compound reached them, and she received the letter with the names written in a healer colleague's careful hand, and she sat with it for a long time in the cold room by the fire. And she let herself feel the weight of it the way she always let herself feel the weight of the ones she didn't save, because she had learned early that the alternative, the armoring, the distancing, made her worse at her work, not better. Calder found her there. He said nothing for a moment after he came in, just sat in the other chair by the fire and let the silence be what it needed to be. And she looked at him sideways after a while and realized he understood this kind of weight in the specific way that people who had been carrying it for a very long time understood it. "You can't save everyone," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm allowed to grieve the ones I don't." He was quiet, then, "Yes, you are." And she heard in it something that sounded like a thing he was also giving himself permission for, though she didn't know yet which specific grief he meant. His recovery was progressing in the way she had hoped. The fever intermittent now, rather than persistent, the long bone pain diminishing. His energy returning in increments she could measure in the length of time he spent at his table before needing to rest. He was, she discovered, a terrible patient in the specific way that capable people were terrible patients. He resented the limitations. He consistently tried to return to full activity before the treatment schedule allowed it, and he had a habit of not mentioning when something was worse because he had classified worse as a failure of will rather than a datum. She had addressed this firmly twice. The third time, she'd found him at his desk after she'd told him to rest. She'd stood at the doorway and looked at him with her most tired expression and said, "The treatment works better when you cooperate with it." And he'd looked back at her with something complicated in his eyes. And then he'd gotten up and moved to the chair by the fire. And she'd brought her notes in and sat across from him, and they'd spent 2 hours talking about nothing to do with illness at all. She learned his history in pieces, the way histories were best learned, not in organized presentation, but in the fragments that surfaced when a person was at ease enough to stop managing their own narrative. His father had ruled before him, briefly and badly. He had taken the alpha position at 22, at the end of a succession crisis that had lasted 3 years, and left the Northern Territory fractured in ways he was still, 13 years later, continuing to repair. The coldness, she came to understand, was not natural to him. Or rather, it had been natural to him once, in the way that a body running a high fever eventually starts to feel normal to itself. He had become cold because coldness was what the situation had required, and then he had stayed cold because warmth felt like risk, and risk felt like the way things fell apart. She told him in exchange about her own history, about her mother, who had been the kind of healer who made it look effortless and wasn't, who had died when Maren was 15 from an illness she had treated in others, and somehow not noticed in herself until it was too late, which was the particular way that healers died, and which had made Maren both deeply attentive to what she carried in her own body and deeply aware of how easy it was to overlook. About her training, about the years of valley work, the deliveries and fevers and broken bones and grief counseling, and all the thousand ordinary intimacies that a healer collected over the years of practice. About the loneliness she had built around herself, not as deliberately as his, but real nonetheless. The particular loneliness of someone whose gift for presence with others coexisted with a deep uncertainty about being chosen by someone else for her own sake, rather than for what she could provide. "You think people only value you for your skills," he said one evening. It was not a question. "Most people who come to me are in pain," she said. "It's not an unreasonable pattern to develop. I came to you because my second finally showed me your messages and I was out of options," he said. "I don't need a healer anymore." He paused. "I still need you in the room." She looked at him across the fire. She was wearing borrowed clothes, her own things finally washed and dried. But she'd gotten comfortable in the softer wool of the northern garments that Priya had found for her, and her hair was loose. And the fire was the warmest thing she'd been near in weeks. And she felt, sitting there, something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was simply at rest. "I know," she said. "I don't know how to ask for what I want," he said. "I've been told I make demands." "That's not." He paused, and she watched him navigate the unfamiliar territory of a sentence he didn't have a practiced form for. "I don't want to make a demand of you. I want to ask. I'm telling you that because the difference matters to me, even though I'm aware I'm not very good at demonstrating it yet." Marin set down the cup she was holding. She looked at him directly, in the way she sometimes looked at patients when she needed them to understand that she was not going anywhere. "Ask then," she said. He held her gaze. "Stay, not through the resolution after. I'm asking you to stay at Vorkath. Not because the bond compels it, not because your skill is useful here, though both of those things are true, because I am better when you're in the room, and I want to know what that means for longer than a fortnight." She was quiet for long enough that the fire shifted and settled, and the shadows rearranged themselves. "I have people in the valley who need me," she said. "I know. I can't abandon them. I know. I'm not asking you to." He leaned forward slightly. "I have resources. Vorkath is connected to every pack in the north. I could bring other healers in to support the valley settlements. I could ensure the outer territories have what they need. I'm not asking you to trade your work for my comfort. I'm asking whether your work and my." He stopped again. She had started to recognize his pauses as the places where honest language required more from him than he had ready vocabulary for. "Whether there is a version of this that doesn't require either of us to lose what we've built." "You've thought about this," she said. "I've thought about very little else for 10 days, he said. "I have also thought about very little else since the morning after you arrived, when you called me by my name without thinking about it, and it was the first time someone had done that in." He stopped. A long time. The fire was very warm. The storm outside the window had subsided to the low, continuous sound of wind off the mountain, which had stopped feeling ominous and started feeling like a kind of constancy. Marin looked at her own hands in her lap. The ink-stained hands, the healer's hands, the hands that had pressed to his forehead in the dark and felt his fever, and something else beneath the fever, something that was about neither illness nor remedy. "I'm going to need to go back to the valley first," she said. "When the resolution is confirmed, to see to my patients, to arrange what needs arranging, to make sure the people who depend on me are covered." "Of course," he said immediately. "And if I come back," she said, "it will be because I've chosen to, not because the bond pulls, not because of what I owe the situation. I need you to understand that distinction." "I understand it," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, flat and clear and without negotiation, that told her he had already understood it before she'd said it, had been waiting for her to say it, had wanted her to establish it because he wanted the thing she was offering to be the real thing, not the compelled one. Then yes, she said, I'll consider it. She had expected the rest of the fortnight to be easier. Now that the question had been asked and a version of an answer had been given, she had not expected the specific difficulty of being near someone who had become essential, while the matter of what to do about that was still open. She understood now why fated mates were described in the old texts as a kind of gravitational force, not because it was involuntary, which it wasn't, but because it required a continuous, active attention to navigate, to choose proximity without surrendering to it, to be honest without being overwhelming, to want something completely and proceed at the pace the reality of it required. She caught him watching her sometimes, not in the way that made her feel studied, in the way that made her feel seen, which was different and harder and more affecting. She caught herself watching him too, mapping the places where the control lived and the places where it gave way, adding to the understanding she was building of who he actually was in contrast to who the world believed him to be. Priya found her one afternoon in the workspace and sat down across from her with the air of a person who had decided to say something and was going to say it without preamble. He's been different since you came, she said. I want you to know that I see it. I've been with him for 8 years. I know what he looks like when he's managing, and I know what he looks like when he's present. He's present. Marin looked up from the herbs she was sorting. That's because he's getting better. Priya's expression was patient and unconvinced. The fever broke 4 days ago. He still has lunch with you every day and sits in that chair until the fire dies. She paused. I'm not saying this to pressure you. I'm saying it because you should have accurate information and because he will never say it himself. Not directly, because he doesn't. He doesn't know how to tell someone that he's. She stopped, and for a moment, something very fond and very tired moved across her face. He's a good man. He's been a very lonely one. You should know that. I do know that, Marin said quietly. Good. Priya stood. The outer settlements sent confirmation this morning. The cascade is reversing. I thought you should hear it first. The news went through Marin like warmth, the specific warmth of a thing she had worked toward that was now real. The illness was resolving. The pack bonds were clearing. The people in the outer settlements who had been suffering for 6 weeks were on the other side of the worst of it. She found Calder with the news, and she watched his face when she delivered it. Watched the relief move through him that was not just personal, but genuinely collective. The Alpha's relief that his people were safe. The specific quality of care that the stories had never mentioned and that she had come to recognize as one of the truest things about him. Your people will need to continue the compound for another 2 weeks, she said. I'll write out the instructions. Any competent healer can administer it from here. And you, he said. I told you. I need to go back to the valley first, arrange things. And then, he said, he asked it the way he'd asked her to stay, without the armor, just the question, just the uncertain and honest thing. She looked at him. She had walked 3 days through a mountain storm to get to this room. And the room had changed when she entered it. And she had spent a fortnight learning the shape of the person who had made it change. And she was not a person who, once she understood something to be true, wasted time pretending she hadn't understood it. And then I'll come back, she said, if you'll have me. The thing that happened to his face then. Not dramatic, not performative. Just the slow and complete arrival of something he had not let himself expect. She filed it away, in the place she kept the things that mattered. The things she returned to when she needed to remember why she did the work she did. I'll have you, he said. I'll have every version of you, all the ones you've shown me and the ones you haven't yet. She crossed the room. It wasn't a long room, but it felt long in the way that every distance felt long when it mattered. When the crossing of it was a declaration as much as a movement, she stood close enough that she could have touched him, and she looked up at the storm gray of his eyes, and she said, I walked 3 days through a blizzard to get to you. You're the most feared alpha in the north, and you don't know how to rest. And you asked me to stay before you knew whether the bond was the reason I came or whether I'd come for you specifically. She paused. For the record, it was both. I came because people needed me, and I will come back because you need me. And eventually, I'm going to convince you that those two things are not in conflict. He was very still. The particular stillness she had come to recognize as his most honest state, the one under the control. The one that was just him, the largeness, and the quiet, and the thing that had been alone for too long. His hand came up and touched her face with a careful precision that reminded her, absurdly, of her own hands on a patient. That kind of attention. That kind of intention. Not tentative. Certain in the way that only things that had been thought about long and hard were certain. How could I not want every part of what you are? He said, so quietly, it was almost just the room saying it. When every part of what you are walked 3 days through a storm to find me. She leaned into his hand. It was a small movement, but it wasn't small. The bond moved between them when she did. She felt it the way she imagined she had always been supposed to feel it. Not like a chain or a command, but like a current. Like the thing in her that had always been looking for its direction finally finding north. She understood standing in the warmth of that current. Why the old texts called it completion. Not because either of them was incomplete, but because together there was a resonance that alone had been inaudible. She kissed him first. She was a healer. She understood bodies. She understood that sometimes the most precise intervention was the one that didn't wait for permission, because the permission had already been given in 100 different ways. And what was needed now was simply the act. And she felt him. The particular release of someone who had been holding on for a very long time, and the bond between them flared warm and certain and real. And the old gray stone warmed by 11 years of his life, and now, by her presence in it, felt for a moment like something that might also be hers. The days after were different, not easier. That word still didn't apply, would probably never apply to either of them, both of them to themselves for ease. Too particular in their gifts and their wounds to ever settle into anything that didn't require tending. But different in the way that a landscape was different once you understood the geography. The same terrain, now navigable. She left for the valley 10 days later, after the final confirmation that the compound had done its work throughout the outer settlements. After she had written out instructions thorough enough to wallpaper a room and sent copies to every healer in the Northern Territory. Priya organized her travel with the quiet efficiency that Marin had come to understand was her particular form of warmth. The road had been cleared by then, the worst of the storm long since passed, and the mountains in the morning light were extraordinary, sharp and white and astonishing in the way that beautiful things were when you'd survived being inside them. Calder walked her to the gate. He didn't say much. He had never been a man who said more than he meant, which she had come to regard as a form of honesty rather than a limitation. He stood at the gate of Vorkath in the morning light, and he looked at her with the storm-gray eyes that she now knew from every angle, in every quality of light, and he said, "You'll come back." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a command. It was something else. The thing on the other side of both of those. The thing that only worked between people who had been honest with each other long enough to trust what they were hearing. I'll come back, she said. She walked the road down from the mountain, with the pack on her back lighter than it had been. On the way up, the oilskin-wrapped herbs mostly used, the bottles mostly empty. Her feet no longer blistered. Because Priya had found her proper boots at some point in the second week, the air was cold and clear and smelled of pine and ice and the particular cleanness of high altitude. And she could feel the bond at the back of her awareness like a compass needle, orienting toward the fortress at the crown of the northern range. And she did not find this frightening. She found it true, and truth, in her experience, was the only foundation on which anything real could be built. The valley work took 3 weeks. There were patients to see and reports to write and healers to coordinate, and the ordinary beautiful grief of returning to the people who had been waiting for her, who had gotten sicker and then better, and who greeted her with the particular warmth of the people who had needed her and felt it when she'd been gone. She worked hard, and she slept when she could, and she wrote to Calder twice, long letters full of the day's particulars. A difficult case. A funny thing a child had said. The specific problem she'd been turning over in her mind about how to address the gap in healer coverage for the outer northern settlements on an ongoing basis. He wrote back. The letters were shorter than hers. She had expected this. But they were precise and genuine, and once, memorably, contained a single sentence at the end that read, "The fire in the study has been lit every night since you left," which told her something he would not have said out loud in those words. And she held the letter for a long time before she set it down. She returned on a morning in early spring when the snow on the mountain road was thawing at the edges, and the air had the particular quality of a world beginning again. The road was easier this time, familiar, the landmarks coming at the right intervals. The bent pine at the first switchback, the stone outcropping shaped like a sleeping animal, the place where the road curved and Vorkath appeared ahead, gray and permanent against the sky. The gates were open when she arrived, not because they'd been watching for her, she understood, though they may have been, but because in a place where the Alpha chose to live with his gates open, rather than his walls high, the landscape changed. The small gesture of it, the gates standing open in the thin spring morning, said more than any declaration could have. She walked in. He was in the courtyard. She thought later that this must be coincidence, that he had not been watching for her, that the timing was simply what it was. And he looked up from the conversation he was having with 2 of his soldiers and went very still, and she kept walking toward him. And the bond between them moved like a song she had known all her life. She looked up at the storm gray of his eyes in the morning light. "I said I'd come back," she said. "You did," he said. "I have a proposal," she said, "about the healer coverage gap in the outer northern settlements. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. It involves Vorkath taking an active coordination role and me splitting my time between the valley and the north for the first year until we can establish something sustainable." Something moved through his expression that she recognized by now as the thing he felt when she made him want to laugh, which he did rarely but with his whole face when he did. "You came back to give me a proposal," he said. "I came back for several reasons," she said. "The proposal is one of them." "And the others?" he said. She looked at him. At the man inside the fortress, inside the mountain. The feared Alpha who didn't know how to rest and had lit the fire every night she'd been gone, who had been alone for 13 years and had learned to call it sufficient, who had asked her to stay with the specific careful uncertainty of a Perseus, offering something he wasn't sure he'd be allowed to keep. "You," she said. "The others are you." He took her hand, there in the courtyard, with his soldiers watching and the spring light beginning to find its way down through the peaks. And he held it in both of his, with the particular certainty of a man who had made a decision and had fully and finally arrived in it. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. The bond between them was not a secret to anyone who had eyes, and the gates of Vorkath were open. And the most feared alpha in the north was looking at a woman from the valley with something on his face that no one who had known him would have been able to name a season ago, because it was an expression he had not worn in public, possibly had not worn at all, until she had walked 3 days through a blizzard and stood in his doorway and called him by his name without thinking about it. Priya, standing at the corridor entrance with a cup of something warm, observed all of this with the expression of a woman who had been waiting 8 years for exactly this outcome and was very carefully not saying so. The bond settled between them like something that had always been true and was only, now finally, being allowed to be. Not chain, not a command, a direction, chosen, the compass needle finding north, and the person holding the compass deciding, with full knowledge and full will, to walk toward it. She stayed. She came and went and came back, and every time she returned the gates were open, and he was different by small degrees that accumulated into the kind of change that only proximity to someone who loved you as you were could produce. She learned the fortress in all its seasons. He learned her in all her moods, the healer's precision, and the valley girl's stubbornness, and the grief she carried for the ones she couldn't save, and the quiet, unperformative joy she took in the ones she could. He stopped managing his stillness around her. She stopped managing the hope she'd spent years keeping carefully bounded. These were not dramatic transformations. They were the ordinary miracle of two people deciding, daily, to be known. The stories about the Alpha of Vorkath shifted in the Valley territories over the year that followed. The way stories always shifted when reality contradicted them long enough. He was still called feared. He was still called powerful, cold, unreachable. But there was a new element now, whispered at first, and then said plainly, that his mate was the healer from the valley, who had walked into the mountain alone and saved his pack, and that he had opened his gates, and that the north was, against all expectation, a little warmer now. Marin heard this particular version of the story secondhand, from a valley patient who had heard it from a trader, who had heard it from someone at the northern settlements, and she sat with it for a moment. The way the facts had been preserved, and the essential thing had been gotten right, if not the precise sequence of events. And she thought about everything that had been between the beginning and this. The 3-day storm, and the bitter compounds, and the late-night conversations, and the hand on her face in the firelight, and the letter about the fire. And then she went back to work, because she was a healer, and there was always work, and the world was large and full of people who needed tending. And she had at last a home to return to.